Hi, we are Made Up Games. My name is Najati. I'm the developer, and with me is Tom, the artist. And this is our stream about our upcoming title, Pine, A Story of Loss, being published by Fellow Traveler. So, without further ado, let's get started. Um,
Sounds
yeah,
good.
cool. Okay, so I'm sure by now the demo is rolling in the stream. um, we can let's start with talking about where where the where the concept of Pine came from. Like, what was the inspiration for it as a concept, and just where the characters in the story came from.
Yeah. So a little while back, right around the time that I actually met you, Najati, I was sort of going through a difficult period, and I had, I think, what would probably be my first major exposure to loss. Well, it was an experience, and from it, I actually got a lot of inspiration um, to sort of just sit with that period of grief. And from it came this character who I started to share on social media, and there was a big response. And um, around that same time, stories started to come together. And Najati and I had been looking for an opportunity to work together on something. And Pine and like the Woodworker character didn't originally reveal itself to be that
Mhm.
project, but I think the more we sat with it and the more we saw people respond to it, the more we thought that actually might be a story worth telling in a different
Mhm.
way, and to sort of in a very direct way try and interpret grief because it's not often a subject that we tend to spend a lot of time
Mhm.
with, or talk about, or embrace. So that was probably the origin of it.
Yeah, I remember getting like the first draft of the story. I'm sure it was sent late at night, and it was in my inbox when I woke up in the morning. And you were like, idea, and it wasn't quite this exciting because of the content isn't super excited content, but it was clearly like something that came to you very strongly, and it was like the story made like an immediate impression on me. And I remember there was like a time where it was like, all right, like, what are you going to do with the story? What are you going to do with the story? And like, we were having separate conversations, like, what game are we going to make? What game are we going to make? And just, it
Yeah.
was like, there was a little while before those two streams were like, well, maybe should we? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely the more wild of choices, probably, like to make it as a game. Like there was the idea to make it as a short animated film, or like a graphic novel, and then I think the part of the making it a game that stood out the most was this idea of like agency and um, being a participant in the
Mm-hmm.
story, and helping to move the story
Mm-hmm.
forward because progress just as a concept was an important part of getting through the grieving
For
process.
sure.
So like how can you make that a big aspect of how you tell the story.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that sort of, leads to the topic of, what about games as a medium lends itself well to this kind of storytelling. I mean, of the sort of like classic media, like movies, books, animated films, things like that have their benefits, and video games have sort of been like typecast as like the certain kind of medium. I tell the joke that whenever I tell my family and friends that I'm making a video game, like their first question is like, well, which is the jump button? and Pine, as you can tell, is I don't need, there is very much not a jump button kind of game. Um,
Yeah.
so what about it being, to elaborate a little bit on what about it being a video game lends itself to telling this kind of story?
I think, it's funny that your family reacts the way that they do to the idea of a video game, because you do get a look from people when you say, like, I'm making a video game, and I think they tend to think of something very different than what we
Mario,
made. um,
yeah.
Mario, right? Um, but, sort of around that same time that I was talking about, where this idea started to come together and you and I were looking for something to work on, there were other games that were sort of setting an example. Like Florence was a big
Mhm.
one. Even Cuphead, I think, because it was made by such a small team. There were things that were so exciting about the game space and the independent game space. And so I think seeing those examples out there kind of gave us, I think, a lot of
For sure.
encouragement to sort of consider it, and also to consider what a game can be, and then to apply it directly to Pine. It was this idea of, like, how can we get you closer to the character, because it is so character
Hmm.
focused, and it is so it being a wordless experience, like, um, a big challenge that you face with making anything like this is, how do you create intimacy? And so, like, agency and intimacy became, like, kind of interwoven in that way. And from there, it was like, okay, that's great as an idea, but, like, how do you stretch that out over the course of a
Yeah.
game? And so that was, like, I think, a really fun challenge for us, to sort of see how we approached problems in a very different ways, but that we kind of could collaborate, from the technical angle and the artistic
Yeah.
angle. So
Yeah, I'm reminded of how different the game looks now in terms of structure versus like what the original. Even if you look at the Kickstarter trailer, it sort of belies a much different vision of how the experience would be structured. Um, so I, maybe touch on sort of like where how we thought it was going to be, and then what it ended up being, just in terms of like the overall structure of the experience.
yeah, I think we originally set out to kind of very much embrace that graphic novel that you can play idea. So, like, going so far as having something like a page
Hmm.
turn, and, like, or, like, to take a page from a previous, or not previous, but just a different medium, and have that inform how we told our story. That was kind of, I think, where we started. And then, you started to just think, well, we don't have to follow those same rules, and that often came with a greater challenge that we would create for ourselves. But, the more often than not, it was still worth doing, because it made for a more unique experience, than you might get from, something that would probably be a little bit more passive. And, like, it's kind of weird to reference, like, God of War, but, like, that's a game that in many ways adheres to a lot of, film techniques, because they are telling an epic tale. But, there was this idea that we don't have to cut cameras, we don't have to do that if, so this, games, again, like, there's a flexibility that, it's challenging to kind of take advantage of it, but it often has some pretty, important rewards, because it is unique to that medium,
Sure.
I think.
Yeah, the in the Kickstarter trailer, you can actually see the page turn that we that we thought was going to be
Yeah.
kind of kind of kind of crucial to the story. I hadn't really thought about it until then, but I feel like at this point, the anybody watching will have seen throughout the demo that one of the main ways you interact with Pine is, these little blue dots or swipes that show up on the screen, and they are embodiments of the action that our woodworker character is taking. Um, and in some ways, I feel like there's almost like they were almost like a direct replacement for the page turn, but a replacement for the page turn that does all the things you were just talking about. Like, with a page turn, you're just like sitting there looking at the things going by, and you like, this happened and this happened. But we made this decision to try to bring the player into the action that they were seeing, and that gives them the direct control. Like, you know, you're not watching him split the wood and then turning the page. You're splitting the wood,
Right.
and then the
Yeah.
next thing happens.
Yeah, and I think that really kind of took things to a different place with the game, like from where we started, and it translated into a little bit of a longer development
For
window. But
sure.
we're excited about about what it yielded, and like what we ended up with.
Yeah, I'll see if I
So
can ask a leading enough question to get you to say the next thing. Like, what, you know, what was one of those challenges that made development more complicated?
I mean, I think we when we were thinking about what does like pine look like from a distance, it's like um, how are we able to tell a fairly linear story, but have this sense of agency? And like, you know, I'm coming from a publishing background, and those stories, if, you know, not counting like choose your own adventure, are very
Hmm.
linear. And you know, the biggest challenge I think of making a game is that one of the key participants to how the game plays and how successful it is the player, and you're you know, you're designing for them. They're not in the room to tell you whether or not you're doing a good
Yeah,
job. So you have to anticipate what they're going to do, and you know, and give them that freedom, which is a pretty big ask. You know, so that was fun to figure
hmm,
out, but it also took time, and then we also, you know, sort of talked a lot about, you know, stuff like the term shoe leather, which you might do a better job of explaining than me. But basically, the in between scenes that more often than not are cut out of storytelling because they're
hmm,
tedious. We embraced the tedium because, you know, the grieving process, you can't fast forward,
right,
you
right.
can't skip to the good parts, you know. So it's like we wanted to make that a part of the story because it felt true to the inspiration.
Yeah, for sure.
So
The term, I'm going to do a terrible job explaining it because I'm not a director, but shoe leather is the term for, you know, all of the footage in a thing where somebody is just going from the thing that's happening to the next thing that's happening, and, you know, the shoe leather of them walking from here's the thing that happened and now they have to get to the next thing that happened. Um, it's really easy for too much shoe leather to interrupt the action of the thing that you're watching, and to like interrupt the rhythm of, you know, the movie or the, you know, the animated feature. You know, we had sort of the opposite problem where if we removed all of that, the things moved too quick, and
mhm.
so much of Pine is like sort of the space between the, you know, you at this point in the playthrough you've seen at least I would expect at least one memory and maybe a second one, and, you know, it's our intent that the spaces where the woodworker is not having a memory, one sort of portray, you know, the quietness that is his experience uh, since his wife has passed, but also lend, you know, a fair amount of weight to those memories when they do happen. And if you're just, if it's constantly like, you know, he's doing his chores, he goes and he cuts down some thatch or he waters the garden, and if it's just like, you know, boom, 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 like one event to the next event. There's none of those spaces between it, and that really robs those memories of, you know, the the opportunity for the woodworker and for you to process them after they happen. So yeah, so pacing and figuring out how much shoe leather to include in the game, and if I can go on for another moment, like
Yeah.
one of the other interesting challenge is this is directly speaking to like the agency, like when you give the player the opportunity to decide, okay, this is the way I'm gonna approach my routine. I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna do this. Um, what we're looking at over the player's experience is like how much time there is between each one of these key storytelling moments being the memories, and if depending on how on how you allocate the memories throughout the game, you could end up in a situation where he does one memory and then the next chore he gets another memory, and maybe there's some accuracy to that in terms of like a real world experience of grieving, but we wanted to be able to sort of control the pace of the experience in such a way that there's like enough time between each one of those memories to sort of like let it let it linger and like let the player sit with it for a little bit. So one of our challenges was like how do you both give agency in terms of the way the character moves through the game, but also retain enough control without it being really obvious what we were doing, but retain enough control to like control the pace of the emotional rises and falls in terms of how often the memories showed up.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to describe it. Like, and I think we did spend a lot of time thinking about when those rewards, if you will, would occur, and because it's funny almost to call them rewards because like they were memories for the characters, so it's not like we're giving you a star or a coin. Like we were giving him something that he already had, and he had sort of forgotten about, and just because he happens to maybe go to similar locations throughout the game and kind of keeps hitting similar triggers, that was a way for us to kind of keep the player engaged, but then also I think do a bit of storytelling where it's like, when you are in his position, triggers in your world exist, and sort of to tie it to that idea of agency, it's like we want to give the player agency. We want to make the player feel like they're in control of the choices that they're making. At the same time, once you give it to them, you can also take it away. So what does that feel like as a player? And how does that then inform your understanding of the woodworker? So it's a lot kind of going on, at least in terms of us trying to figure out how to balance that. And it's something that I think we did a pretty good job of doing throughout the experience.
Yeah, for certain. It was one of our primary design goals. It's very much. It feels like very much one of those things that you, uh, like you've. If we've done our job right, you wouldn't be able to tell that there was even a job to do. Like it would almost feel like, of course, it's happening at the time, and a lot of effort was put into trying to make it feel like pretty natural and effortless, and sort of like surprising when it needs to be a little bit surprising, and quiet when it needs to be a little bit quiet, and fingers crossed we we managed to maintain, like find the right balance.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe jumping a bit. Well, we talked about like the little blue swipes and dots for our like main way to sort of move the action forward. We've also at this point in the trailer definitely seen at least a couple what we're calling interactives. If I don't even know if that's a word, but we've been using it a lot over the
Yeah.
last 3 years. The kind of like our mini games, for lack of a better word. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So those, I think, are important not only because they are more engaging, I think we'd argue, than those swipe and gesture puzzles. They do kind of bring the player even closer to not just the woodworker, but also the wife and their relationship. But that's, I think, our way of kind of telling this unconventional love story in a way. So like you're getting these experiences that he clearly cherished as a character, the character
Right.
cherished, and that's probably why they're more involved. So like we talked about this idea of like a focal point for when he does experience memories, and why, like, when we remember things in life, why do certain things stand out more than others? Rather than try and figure out the why of that, we kind of just were like, that's an interesting thing to think about through the lens of a game. So like there's the memory of that day and all of the things that happened, but there was that one moment that was like maybe his favorite moment.
Right.
And I think that was, just those pieces of the memories were the things that we really like latched onto, and we're like, okay, so this is sort of, you could call it a reward for the player because it's a little bit lighter. It's maybe more
A little more gamey.
more fun,
Yeah.
more gamey, yeah. But it's also like meant to be sort of representative of like how powerful these memories are to him and how important they are, and then to go one step further, how powerful his response to them is, and what he chooses to do, and what you, the player, choose to do. So that was a something that I think we discovered as we worked on it, how important those moments were. I feel like we did them. We did them mostly from a position of wanting to have a balanced experience originally, and then I think the more we developed them, we were like, oh no, this is like an opportunity to really get that intimacy that we were talking about. It's like, and then it makes the lack of those moments in the shoe leather moments more potent.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, no, the interactive design was challenging, kind of on many levels. One, there was, we wanted each one of them to be distinct, which as an ostensible game designer was probably a silly choice, giving yourself like, this whole story thing to work out, and then like, yeah, just come up with a bunch of mini games to throw in it, and make sure they're at least reasonably entertaining. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, not the most sensible choice, perhaps. And then just making sure that they're all like, like immediately playable. One thing we haven't touched on that we should probably make sure to go back to is just like how important accessibility as a theme to the game is. Just in short, before I get back to it at some point, it was super important for us to make sure the game was accessible, and to, even though we wanted to have things in there that, gamers would enjoy, make sure that those things would be enjoyable and pleasant to people that didn't have like a long history playing video games. So yeah, that was another challenge. And then, just like, random technical challenges, like making sure they run on all different platforms and stuff. But, making sure that they were like engaging, enjoyable, and accessible and bespoke to each memory was pretty interesting. I feel like we did all right.
Yeah. I think so. Yeah. And I think like, kind of a weird way to think about it is like Pine is the game that I wish that I had, in the moment, because, the inspiration for the game
back
is
when you were dealing with your not so fun time.
Yeah. When I was having my, my difficult period, like I think, going through loss, I would have appreciated, someone else's interpretation of it, because it can be very isolating. And so, that's like I think setting out, it was to make a game or make a story almost for myself.
For sure.
And for you, because we were working together. And then, we had this quiet hope that it would also be valuable to someone who was going through that similar experience.
Yeah.
Because it is a shared experience. And again, we don't tend to discuss it, but it was, that was important. So
yeah, for sure. Yeah, I don't want to, for those watching the stream, I don't want to like sort of like gloss over this moment as sort of, or this, what Tom just said as kind of like an addendum to a more important answer. This is kind of like one of the key themes behind Pine is like what you know, it's obviously a story about loss and a story about grieving, um, and you know the we you know, early on when we were deciding to take on the project, there was you know several conversations about like what is our ethos behind it? Like, are we trying to like you know are we going to do a bunch of research on like all of like the latest like psychological research on like what grief is and the best way to handle it and yada yada yada, or are we going to like you know like gamify it and like you know you can whoever collects the most thatch is going to be like the most or the least grieving? Like what is our philosophy towards the subject of grief itself? And, you know, Tom just gave the answer to that question. It's like you know it is a telling of one person's experience through of grieving through something, with the hope that it is you know familiar enough to those going through it to know that you know people they're not alone. You know they're not alone. Tom says this. You know you're not alone in grieving. Like you know everybody grieves alone, but everybody grieves, and you know everybody's been through it. So you know like you know don't think that you're out there alone when you're grieving. It's also, and I don't this you know I will ask a question, but I don't know if we'll be able to answer it because it might be a spoiler. But like, there's also sort of the question of like, you know, what is Pine gonna say about getting through it? You know, like, is Pine a game that begins and ends with sadness, or is there like you know because we you know I guess I can say one thing we definitely didn't want to do was end up on like you know no shade to Disney, but to like end up on like the Disney end of the spectrum, where it's like you know like like maybe I'll edit this out if thinks if Tom says I can't say it after we're done with the stream. But like, pretty safely say that like at the end of Pine, he doesn't like end up on like OK Cupid and like start dating again and like find his and like find his next wife. Like that's not like the kind of you know it's about the grief. But where we end up in terms of like what's at the end of that process for the sake of the story that we're telling was an interesting question, and maybe that's all we'll say about that. I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think not every story needs to end the way that you might expect, and that was actually one of the bigger challenges. I think was like making sure that we stayed true to that like goal.
Yeah,
It can be pretty hard, you know,
sure.
to anyone who's listening who's probably doing something creative. Like they know that challenge of, you know, not necessarily because something is easier, but you know, sometimes it's hard to kind of stay in the headspace when you're making something a little bit on the heavier side.
For sure.
So anyway,
That's interesting.
yeah.
Just a quick, maybe a quick anecdote before getting back to the main line of the conversation. It was like one of when we were originally approached by a fellow traveler, you know, we were like overjoyed at the opportunity, but immediately the fear set in of like, we've heard stories of like working with game publishers and like wanting to like, you know, it's like how long would we be working on Pine before they were like, looter shooter
Yeah.
and you know they were surprisingly game for how paranoid we were about about like maintaining control over the story, and working with them like has been I think like you know like you know full of all sorts of pleasant surprises. But you know this one it was you know really encouraging to just be working with people who were so supportive of the experience we were trying to put together.
Yeah, it's actually kind of shocking the number of times we seem to almost test that on the, you know, with them and just be like, "You guys sure?"
Yeah, you sure about it? It's not very. The game's not very fun. Are you sure you still?
Yeah, but they knew. I think they knew from the beginning,
Yeah.
you know, what we were aiming for, And, I think where we got really lucky is how much they cheered us on when we were. I think when we would kind of joke about things, I'm sure they could tell that that was probably coming from a place of fear. And they were like, no, I think, the original goal is sound. It's just you got to stick to
Right.
it. Like, I think we definitely count ourselves very, very fortunate
Certainly. I remember.
that they are in our corner, because yeah, it's
I
it's
remember. I remember at some point, at least a year ago, at this point, um, like when we went through that panic about whether we should make it more like Monkey Island, and you can like move the character, you click around, and like the character moves to your cursor, and you're like,
yeah,
and like I even spent like a day and a half like prototype, like trying like figuring out how to prototype that a little bit, and then we
yeah,
had our production meeting the next day, and our producer at the time was like, no, just
yeah.
we were like we were gonna do this thing that would have been really cool, but we think it would have been hard. And he was just like, "No, man, original vision, original vision." And I was like,
Yeah,
"All right, all
yeah,
right, Phew, phew." Yeah. Um.
yeah,
All right, cool. Maybe let's jump back to the we were talking about interactions a little while ago. At this
yeah,
point in the stream, the demo has has finished. So anyone watching will have seen kind of like the sort of big reveal interaction that I guess isn't a big reveal because it's in the trailer, but sort of the big third reaction, or sorry, the big third interaction, which is our carving mechanic.
yeah.
Yeah.
So this was a very surreal thing to witness the first time Najati built it, to the point where it was like you could play it and really kind of get lost in it. But talk about getting closer to the character. Like, we wanted his reaction to the state that he's in and the memories that he's experiencing to be something, tangible, or at least as close to tangible as we could get. So he, is afraid that he will be forgetting these moments. So he begins to make carvings of them. And I remember in the beginning of developing Pine, and Najati and I would have these conversations, and he would say crazy things like, "I can build that," and I would be like, "Okay, sure," and then I would just sort of go to sleep that night, being like, "That silly Najati." But one day he shared it with me, and I was like, "Okay, this makes this game that much more special to me, because I just never thought that this kind of thing would be doable with a small team like ours." And so, that's just a special thing in and of itself. But, what it does for us is it allows the memories and the significance of the memories to the woodworker to really kind of be cemented, I think, in the player's mind. And, participating in that was something that, like, I think is probably at the core of Pine.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the in the Kickstarter trailer there was a carving interaction. And it was like a little 2D thing where it looked like you were sort of like drawing out scoops to draw the outline of
Right.
thing. I mean, it was always in our mind that carving would be a big part of the experience because carving was such a key component to how the woodworker's character was dealing with what he was going on. We haven't really talked much about the Instagram posts, some of the Instagram posts that inspired so much of what we're doing. But in all of them, the character was like, had clearly been like laboring over this memento that he was creating, and with some reflection, you realize that it's a thing for him to hold on to. He's got these memories, and the memories happen, and then they go away. He's not ready to let go. So he makes these artifacts that he gets to hold on to, and they're such a key part of his experience that it only felt right to make them a key part of the game experience. The idea to do it in 3D was, looking back upon it, a questionable idea. It took a fair dinkum of work. it definitely needs to go through QA before it's released. But yeah, no, it was an idea that thankfully, didn't fall prey to the sunk cost fallacy and just like have to be let go. But it did come together. Pretty happy with the way it came together. And hopefully the players that get to go through it will have the experience of, something similar to what the Woodworker is doing. It's also one of those interesting moments where it's the tricky balance between like engagement and enjoyment and
Yep.
what the Woodworker would be experiencing one of those moments. We never really want Pine to not be fun, but it's, for anybody who's familiar with like the types of fun, like it's definitely not a type 1 fun kind of game where it's like fun while you're doing it. You're like, I nailed that jump, I nailed that combo, I nailed, you're not going to get that immediate visceral, dopamine hit from many of the things you do. But I think maybe the carving is one of the times we get closer to that, just because of how satisfying and how like tactile it is. But it is also something that requires a little bit of patience to get through, and it's not like nailing a double jump or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it's time spent. It's like, I remember when I first was doing it, that like there was a soothing quality to it. It felt therapeutic. I think maybe perhaps because at that point I had familiarized myself with the character. I understood why he was doing it, and that was kind of all I needed. And then to have the added benefit of being able to spend that time doing it. Going back to that idea of shoe leather, it's like, how else would that have been interpreted if this were a more passive experience? So, from a storytelling perspective, it felt powerful because it was not something that the character was willing to skip over. So, we wanted the player to then experience that. And this maybe is a half decent segue to this idea that like you can't lose Pine. It's not an experience that you're meant to lose. It, like grief, is something that is for you to get through, and it is doable. It's just, it takes time,
For sure.
so that was I think Najati's ability to create that in that three-dimensional form, despite it being mind-bogglingly difficult at times. He would send me screenshots of like what I think either inside his brain or inside his computer,
A little
or
bit of
like both maybe. And I was like, okay, he's in the Matrix. I'll talk to him in like a day.
Yeah.
But it was like, you stuck the landing, and that makes the whole, I mean, I would play just that, aside from it being part of a larger story. So
Yeah, I would send screenshots of like the internals of the structure as it's being carved, and like all of the debug information overlaid on it, and like all of the random bits of like vectors and math that was going on to all of the artists on the team as punishment, because I was the only one doing math. And if I had to do it, everybody else had to look at it, and that seemed only fair.
there was one time when you sent a photo, and it was just sort of multiple grids over each other, like on a dark gray background, and there was numbers throughout, and there was a 75 like right in the middle, and you're like, see that 75? And I was like, yes. And he's like, you're like, that's not supposed to be there. That's a problem. And
I'll see if I can find that particular screenshot and put it in the stream.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was so yeah, it's kind of like magic. I mean, it was pretty
Math
wild
is
to see
magic,
come
kids.
together.
Stay in school.
There you go. That's the message.
Yeah, that's why we made Pine.
Yeah.
It's a motivation. It's a math motivational PSA.
Yes.
Before we get too far from it, you said you mentioned Pine. You can't lose at Pine, and that was another, I feel like, interesting design goal. It's one of the things that another one of the constraints we were talking about our interactive / mini games earlier. It's another one of the design variables for each, for each one of those experiences. Like, how do you design it so that, some of them will take a little bit more time than others. There was the planting interaction. Like, you do have to at some point figure out how to plant them all together. Though at that point, that's the solution to that is enough places on the internet that that would it might even be, no, it's not in the trailer. We have to take them out of the trailer, but it's,
No, no,
yeah,
yeah,
it's certainly in
almost.
this live stream though, so the solution does exist. But some of the, like the, like the rhythm game one, like some people aren't so great at rhythm games, and there's another sort of like musical based one later in the game. Um, each one of these things needed to be designed in such a way that that like people that are players that are I don't want to say engaged, but players that are like a little more familiar with gaming mechanics and stuff like that will have the satisfaction of playing them. But we don't want anybody that's not experienced as a gamer to like just get stuck and sit there and not be able to make it through. Because that's not like
Yeah,
we don't want our lesson about grief to be like, if you suck at video games, you're
yeah,
stuck. Yeah.
yeah. I think it was again, we kind of talked about embracing the tedium, but we never wanted you to feel defeated, I guess, because that wasn't our mission, or part of our mission, I should say.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
You also touched on, and when we talked about how the carving is 3D now, I think the other thing that is 3D in a maybe more subtle and maybe even more interesting way is the world that the game takes place in. Um,
Mhm.
People who have played video games will have noticed that it's definitely not like 3D modeled. There aren't like trees, like 3D tree models and 3D bushes, and the character is not 3D. But it does have the look of for lack of a less technical phrase, like correct perspective and in the game. Uh, but all of the trees are hand drawn and the bushes are hand drawn, and do you want to talk a little bit about how that came together?
Yeah, that was. I remember when you first started sort of talking about how we could do that and could translate the backgrounds that we had been painting and the spaces that I'd been attempting to create, through just painted backgrounds, could feel a little bit more realized, or a little more representational, if you will. And honestly, it wasn't until I think we started to build it that I could see how that would really benefit the game. And I think the big one for me was that it kept this sense of scale and space consistent and just significantly larger than what we had before.
Yeah.
And I think, as a result, further isolated the woodworker in a pretty big way, and also made these memories that he encounters a little bit more unpredictable. Because when the space was bigger, it felt like, well, where are these things? Because I know that those memories are out there, and like, what's going to set them off? So, but I think that sort of sense of isolation was significant to me, and something that I think I'd kind of had in my head for a little while when we first started talking about the story, and how there is this big field, and I just had that visual of him at a distance and just how alone he looks. It's actually one of my favorite shots from the intro. So making it a 3D space, it almost like loosened things up in a bit,
Yeah.
because then you're like, Najati's big passion, one of his big passions in games, is world building, and there's so many different ways to do that, and for us it was that actual physically large space, and then then you've basically got the biggest mural ever to sort of paint over.
For
And
sure.
how do you do that? Because you can't, even if you paint the whole thing starting in one spot and then going to the other, like, you'll probably never get it done. So we had to sort of build a certain number of assets and build a certain number of tools to then, fill that space.
Yeah.
And that was like very difficult at first because it was so overwhelming, but it's like, you know, a big lesson from making this game is like that incremental approach, and how much if you just do a little bit at a time, like one day all of a sudden you'll kind of look around and you're like, okay, like there's actually
Yeah, for sure.
something coming together here. So that was really cool at that point. Like it was having, even like when, we're using Unity to build this, and you'll have your scene and you have these like pieces and you have this animation, and all of a sudden you feel like you've got a stage in front of you and you've got like, not an actor, but like
Right.
something like
Yeah.
that. So anyway, it was, I think building it out like that was, difficult at first, but also like very rewarding and very fun and very, I think, crucial to how
Yeah.
Pine looks now.
Yeah, it was certainly a bit of a risk. When the idea of doing it this way sort of was born out of the idea of, well, it was when we were storyboarding the game initially for like the page turny version of Pine. We were just looking at all the art that was going to need to be generated for the game, and it was just like, the initial storyboarding, there was like a few thousand shots, and each one of those shots had like basically a bespoke background, because it was like, this happens here and that's behind him, and then you turn the camera here or turn the camera here and it's this behind, and then he's like looking at this and this is behind the thing he's holding. um and it was kind of a hard decision to make, because the hand drawn look of the game was like one of the key things we wanted to maintain. Like, we wanted it to feel as much as possible like a fully illustrated like video game, or I'm sorry, a fully illustrated like animated short. Uh so so I was like, well, how can we, how like what can we do to maintain that, but make it so that we don't need to like hire 5 extra artists just to draw all of the backgrounds. um and this idea for the 3D world came to mind, but one of the key things we wanted to be able to do was like compose the world basically fully of illustrations, or drawings that Tom did of art, like environmental assets, to make sure that the world had that illustrated look. The one thing you're not supposed to do is like layer transparent sprites in front of each other in 3D space, just because you have to sort all of them. This will be a good opportunity to put some like nerdy B-roll of Unity while I'm talking about this. But yeah, like did a whole bunch of work in dealing with all sorts of fancy technology, um, to do this thing that you're not supposed to do, that if we've done it right, you won't even be able to tell that we're doing it. Like, it should just, hopefully the world just looks like, about as close to each one, like a drawing as we can reasonably get it. And I feel like we've ended up, I kind of love the way the game looks. I'm pretty proud of like how all of the art you drew and all the code that I wrote came together to give us this pretty distinct look. And it gives us this tremendous flexibility of being able to be like, like, instead of it being like, oh, we want to do this new shot, now you have to draw a whole new background. Now it's sort of like, yeah, we've got the character frame for that. We can just point the camera in that direction, and we've got a pretty decent looking world around him, which was both challenging and I think rewarding to get through. So maybe we should talk about the audio side of things for just a moment.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, I think we said earlier that the music and the sound are the voice of Pine, and I think that's true to me. I don't know if you would phrase it differently, Najati, but like,
No, it's good.
like funny story, like Tyler, our composer, came to us through Najati. You were
We're good friends.
learning piano. Yeah, very good friends, and so. I don't think Tyler would have been an obvious choice at the very beginning, just because we were sort of telling Pine, it's like this unconventional love story in a way, and it's about grief and everything. I don't know really what I had in mind for it, but then when you said that we might have the opportunity to work with Tyler on it, and I started to listen to his work, and I realized like, oh, actually, he could be an exceptional fit
For
for
sure.
this. You know, um, how he and I don't have the same technical knowledge of music like you and Tyler do, but sort of the way that he manipulates sound and pulls music apart was really exciting for us,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, we're super fortunate to be able to work with Tyler on the project. He's got a fairly distinct like musical voice, and he does like lots of super interesting things with texture and sort of like bending and stretching sounds when he wants to, and his stuff can also sound like super clean. Originally I think we were thinking that the soundtrack of Pine would be like much more like typical and orchestral and sort of like instruments with like pieces written and stuff, and I think that would have worked. I think that would have worked well. But I'm way more excited about the approach that we have. The It's sort of like another one of the interest. Like we haven't really talked about the way our characters look in the world, but like there's an interesting tension between the characters in anything in motion and like the world itself being like fairly painted and the characters being I don't want to say cartoony, but like I don't have the I don't have the
Yeah,
yeah um
I think it's fair.
yeah but the music provides another interesting tension, not just with the rest of the world sometimes, but also with itself. And yeah, just and being able to be a little bit more abstract with it lets it sort of like lean into what's happening to him with like coming in and out of memories in ways, like I loathe to think like what the transitioning into or out of memory sound would be like without some like post processing and some like destructive effects and stuff like that. Like would it be like a harp like like we would have risked falling into some musical tropes that instead we can have some like really really powerful musical treatment to them. And then later in the game, without giving too much away, there's some parts where we get to lean even more on like Tyler's just like kind of destructive approach to music and composing, which are really exciting.
Yeah, the thing that surprised me the most when I was playing through after having his, after he had an opportunity to get his hands on it, was when music plays a part.
Mm-hmm.
And this, the moments you would expect music to have a role,
Yeah.
and the moments where you very much don't
Oh, for sure.
expect music to have a role, but it kind of shows up and it completely it hits you in a very profound way,
Mm-hmm.
and it doesn't take much.
For
That's
sure.
the other surprising thing. It's like I think Tyler has a very strong grasp of um, how much he needs to add to really kind
Mm-hmm.
of start to have an
Yeah,
impact,
for sure.
and then still leave himself an extraordinary amount of space to
To make
take it
that
further.
impact,
Or
for sure.
yeah, right. So that was really where I was most grateful for the chance to have him be a part of Pine, was when it went from being like, oh, we're kind of just like layering music on top of this experience. No, it's like Tyler understands that we're accounting for that player again, right? So how then do you, rather than slapping music on top, how do you integrate it
Mm-hmm.
into the story,
And like
and have
involve
it
it
be,
involve it in the pacing. We were talking about the pacing
yeah,
of things
like it
before.
is.
The music is integrated right into that.
Yep. Yeah. So I wasn't expecting that.
Yeah.
And I think that I'm very excited for that kind of, there's a moment in particular that I'm excited for people to all have, just because it did catch me off guard in a very good way.
Yeah. The other half of the audio treatment is our sound designer, Andy Martin, who my favorite story about Andy is the story that Tom tells about Andy. So
I just when we again we were introduced to Andy through a friend of mine, another composer in the game space, and we quickly realized that Andy also had this history of contributing to some pretty wonderful projects, some of which Najati holds very dear to his heart. And so we were initially excited, like, this is great. Like, here's someone who clearly has the expertise and experience. And then we find out that Andy just wanders into the woods sometimes and sort of records sound for weekends at a time. So, you know, we almost were just like,
Yeah, it was
well, then
comical. It was
you
comical.
want to get paid to do that? You know, it's like,
Yeah. Which can we give you a
so,
little bit of money for the things you do?
yeah, yeah. So, and it just felt very serendipitous, I guess. I don't know if that's the right use of the
That's
word. I
part of
never
it.
do.
Yeah.
But, um, and it was just sort of this running joke, I think, throughout the whole project, where Andy would be like, "Well, you know, I'm going away this weekend," and like anytime anyone else says they're going away, it's like they're going upstate or something.
Yeah. Going to
Like Andy
Cancun,
was
weekend
like,
in Cancun.
yeah, and he's like, "I'm becoming one with the wilderness again, and then I will be back." So it was just, but it was obviously very fortuitous for us to have someone who already had a passion for the sounds that we were after. So
Yeah.
that was really cool.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and you know, it's weird if you want to get like a tiny window into what it's like making a game. Go like pick up your favorite game or a couple of your favorite games and play them on mute, and like
Yeah.
try not to fill in the sounds that are playing. Just try to play the game without any sound, and you like their like games are like I don't know, like 70-80% sound. Like the sound in the music does so much of the work of the vibe of what you're doing, and what you're experiencing. So you like, as you know, as we've been developing it, we've been looking at it, you know, in Unity largely without sound, just like making sure things work and connecting things up and yada yada. So you get used to the game without sound, and it's like it's pretty easy to be like this is bad. Like even like when things start to visually come together, it's like this doesn't feel right. And then as soon as you like layer in some like strong environmental sounds, and especially when you like layer in some impactful music, you're like, oh, that's what, you know, that's what was missing. So, you know, huge kudos
And
to our sound designer and our composer for really making. I joke it. I've made the joke many times that we're making like, and no idea how long the game is actually going to be, which is maybe not something we should say in the stream. But you know, like we joke like making an hour and a half to 2 hour long music video for interactive music video for Tyler's music is sometimes what it feels like we're doing, just because we know that as soon as the music is in there, everything just like, you know, hits that much harder. I was about to say we're on Fellow Travelers Discord. Definitely come. There's a channel for Pine, a Story of Loss on there, and you know, as you know, because of where you're watching the stream, the Steam listing is up. A wish list on the game makes a huge difference. So we would definitely appreciate a wish list if you're interested in the project. Come by and give us a shout out, or you know, ask questions or whatever on Discord. And thanks again for watching.
thank you, everyone. And thank you, Najati. And
Yeah.
thanks.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you for drawing all of the awesome things that I get to put into a video game.
And thanks for programming some crazy number of lines of code.
Yeah, it's a lot of them. We did. I'm bummed that we didn't get to talk about like our approach to animation, but maybe we'll do like a YouTube video or something about it. This has gone on long enough. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Time for us to be quiet. Yeah.
All right.
Awesome. Well, thanks everybody for watching, and see you around, and happy gaming.
Bye, everybody.
Cheers.